Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 661 Bloody Battle, Part 2. Seeing that his tactic of throwing torches to burn the ship was cracked, Wallace was very depressed. The French threw the torches back, and the British ship almost caught fire. As a last resort, the British had to stop this ineffective tactic. However, there was a lot of sheep oil on the ship, which would be wasted if it was not used. So Wallace had an idea. He ordered his men to pour sheep oil on the iron chain that the French hooked on the English ship. The messenger under his command opened his voice and began to loudly convey the order. Sure enough, the iron chain poured with sheep oil was extremely slippery. The French sailors climbed the iron chain desperately, but when they got close to the British ship, they suddenly slipped. Many French sailors accidentally fell into the water. Then, the French offensive suddenly stagnated. But this method did not work either. Because the experienced French officers asked the French sailors to wrap their palms with linen, which greatly improved their ability to resist oil slippage. However, although they climbed over the iron chain, the French sailors felt more slippery after picking up the scimitar again. Some French sailors were knocked by the English sailors when they were slashing at each other, and their scimitars accidentally slipped out of their hands. Of course, this was only part of the situation. Moreover, after the French hooked the British ships with multiple chains, they would let the French ships approach them. When the distance between the two ships reached a very close point, there was no need to climb the chains at all, but to jump directly, which was the legendary jump-boat gang. The British ships hooked by the French ships were inconvenient to move, and could only watch other French warships approach. Then, the French sailors jumped over like frogs. Wallace's flagship was in the center of the English warships, and had not yet been flanked by the French. But as the battle became more intense, sooner or later the French would jump onto Wallace's ship. In fact, 70 French warships against 54 English warships had advantages, but they were not particularly obvious. In order to resist for a while longer, and being flanked by the French on the left and right, Wallace surrounded the fleet, so only the outer ships were strongly besieged by the French. This is a tortoise formation, lacking offensive power. But Wallace's original intention was not to attack the French, but to delay time. Moreover, because he could not give way, he could not use the conventional tactics of seizing the upper hand and then attacking the enemy ship. Because, to fight against the wind, you need to maneuver to the windward side. If you are not good, you will give up the route to the French fleet. Therefore, he can only form a tortoise formation in front of the French fleet and fight with the other side. Moreover, according to the agreement, the reinforcements should arrive at dusk. It is now about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. As long as you hold on for another hour or two, you will complete the task. Therefore, Wallace put his flagship in the middle, in fact, to protect himself. After all, if you complete the task, you can become a baron. If you die in battle, you will not be able to enjoy this wealth. It takes several hours for the French to break through all the warships. And Wallace only wants to hold on for 2 or 3 hours, and he doesn't need to hold on to the end. Therefore, he used the tortoise tactics to let the outer warships fight with the enemy. His sinister intentions were not clear to the English sailors under his command, and even if they were clear, they would not say anything. After all, in this era, isn't it natural for civilian soldiers to fight to the death to defend the nobles? Of course, Wallace is not a mediocre person, he also has 2 brushes. He found that when the English fleet was trapped by the French, only the outer warships of the English fleet would fight the French in close combat. The English warships in the circle did not fight. No, it's too wasteful. So Wallace ordered, let the English sailors in the inner circle connect the English warships in the outer circle through ropes. Then, jump on the friendly warships in the outer circle and put the battlefield on the outer circle ships. After receiving the order, the English warships compressed the space again, and some ships were almost close to each other. So, the sailors on the inner circle warships came to the outer English warships through ropes or directly jumped off the boats. The French just defeated the British sailors on several outer English warships with their numerical advantage. But in a blink of an eye, the enemy replenished their troops. So, the fight continued. Relying on the continuous flow of sailors from the inner circle, the British sailors successfully repelled the French. However, the price was also very shocking. The deck was full of corpses, some of them were English and some were French. In fact, Wallace's tactic of gathering all the warships together was a stupid move. If they met the Chinese Navy commanders, they would definitely board the fire ship without hesitation. At this time, the English warships huddled together and were very close to each other. This situation is somewhat similar to the chained ships of Chow's army in the Battle of Chibi. If you encounter a fire fleet, you will definitely not escape the fate of destruction. However, for some reason, Europeans have never used fire ship tactics. It was not until 1633 that the Dutch fleet was burned back by Zheng Zhilong in the Far East that the Dutch learned this wretched tactic. Then, in 1639, the Dutch naval commander Martin Trop used the Oriental fire ship tactics obtained from the Dutch East India Company to burn dozens of large Spanish warships in one fell swoop and won the Downs naval battle. Moreover, it eventually won the Netherlands an independent status. Anyone who has read Romance of the Three Kingdoms and sees Wallace's turtle formation will definitely be happy to prepare fire ships. Then, the English fleet will definitely be defeated. But the French are more rigid than the English, and some knights are dogmatic. How can they understand the tactics of fire ships? Not to mention fire ships, even rockets are relatively less prepared. Therefore, Wallace's fleet encountered the French, who were idiots in naval warfare, and there was no danger. Seeing the French army being beaten back, the French commander Count Valgeri was very annoyed. However, seeing the British tactics of using inner circle sailors to support outer circle ships, he was helpless. After all, the opponent used a tactic of local advantage, which made the French feel a little tricky. But soon, Valgeri thought of a countermeasure: you use the sailors of the inner circle ships to support the outer circle ships, and my French fleet can also follow suit. So, Count Valgeri asked the outer French warships to approach the ships in the inner circle that were close to the British fleet. Then, learning from the British, the sailors on other ships were also sent to the inner circle ships in contact with the British. In this way, the French would not be at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. In fact, because the French were originally more numerous, they had the advantage in numbers. At this time, the main fleets of Britain and France were surrounded and close to each other. The ships were crowded together, and the British and French sailors on the ships jumped to the ships that were in contact with each other by means of jumping off the boats and climbing ropes, and fought a bloody battle on the decks of the outer ships of England. One group of people rushed up and was chopped down, and another group continued to go up. Such a refueling tactic made the decks of the outer circle of English warships a sure field. The decks were full of corpses, and the blood dyed the decks red, as if the decks were painted red. The screams of the sailors who were stabbed also resounded on the battlefield. The sailors of Britain and France were all bloodthirsty, and they rushed forward in waves and fought with each other. Even at the end, in order to free up enough space to fight the enemy, they kicked the bodies of their comrades off the deck into the sea to free up space to fight the enemy. On the stern of the inner circle of the English fleet, Wallace walked around anxiously, looking at a large pocket watch or pocket clock next to him from time to time. The British casualties were getting bigger and bigger. If they continued to fight like this, the small British army would definitely not escape the fate of defeat. Now, Wallace could only pray that the reinforcement fleet would arrive on the battlefield quickly. Otherwise, he would be dead. Chapter 662, Confrontation on Land. While fierce naval battles broke out between England and France at sea, the land was not idle either. It was estimated that the time was almost up, and Henry VII's trusted General Richard Bull led 20,000 British troops to attack Hastings port occupied by the French. At this time, the French had built 10 temporary long bridge docks in Hastings port. Together with the more than a dozen long bridge docks in Hastings port before, Hastings port had basically met the conditions for large-scale landing of the French army. However, all this became irrelevant with the arrival of Richard Bull's army. When Richard Bull's 20,000 troops arrived at Hastings port, Abel, the French commander guarding Hastings, was shocked. He quickly withdrew all the French infantry on the dock back to the city, and even the 5,000 French militiamen withdrew into the city to help defend the city. However, although the walls of Hastings city were tall and strong, the 4 city gates were burned by the original defenders. Abel was very careful and sent people to block the north, west and east gates with stones, but the south gate was not blocked. After all, the south gate still needs to be entered and exited. After the French army landed, they also needed to enter and exit Hastings. Therefore, the south gate was only guarded by heavy troops and a temporary fence was built, but there was no special strong gate. After Richard Bull led the army to the city, he also found that the north, west and east gates were blocked. So he ordered Send a few cavalry to the south gate to see what's going on there. Not long after, several English light cavalry came back and reported to Richard Bull. Sir, the south gate is not blocked, there are only simple fortifications, but now it is full of French people. If you want to break through the south gate defense line, it is estimated that there will be great losses. Abel also knew that the south gate was a weakness, so he arranged 2,000 of the 5,000 soldiers in the city to guard the south gate. The other 3,000 soldiers, along with 5,000 French militiamen, went to the top of the city wall to scare the British. 2,000 elite infantrymen guarded a city gate, and there were various obstacles at the gate. It would cost a lot to break through the city gate. However, the script did not go as Abel imagined. After thinking for a while, Richard Bull gave an order directly. The whole army will go to the south gate of Hastings, and then line up there. Half of them will guard against the French army in the city, and the other half will go directly to dismantle the docks. Then, the 20,000 British troops ignored the French army on the top of the city wall and the other 3 gates, and went directly to the south gate. Just when Abel thought that the British army would launch an attack on the city, the British army stopped and lined up 100 meters outside the south gate. Moreover, it looked like a defensive formation. At first, Abel was a little confused, but when he saw the British army behind him dismantling the Long Bridge wharf in Hastings Port from the top of the city wall, he finally got anxious. Abel knew very well that the biggest task of the 5,000 soldiers he led was to serve as the vanguard for the main force of the French army. Therefore, the wharf is very important. Because the French army must use the wharf when they come. However, if the army is guarded on the wharf, it will not work. Because the wharf has no defensive facilities, it is easy to be defeated when facing the impact of the enemy's large forces. Therefore, the French army had no choice but to rely on the tall and solid walls of Hastings City to defend themselves. Moreover, according to the convention of this era, the opponent should attack the city first. Generally, they take over the wharf as an auxiliary facility after taking the city. However, Richard Bull had already received instructions from Henry VII and Thomas Stanley, asking him to dismantle the wharf first when he went to Hastings. Without the wharf, even if the French fleet defeated Wallace's fleet, it would not be able to land here. Even if they could force a landing, Richard Bull's 20,000 troops were waiting on the shore. Moreover, in the absence of a dock, at most the infantry could force a landing by waiting. As for the knights, they could only take off their plate armor and wade ashore by themselves. At the same time, neither horses or artillery could force a landing without a dock. In this way, even if the French army forced a landing by waiting, they would become a living target for the 7,000 English longbowmen brought by Richard Bull. Therefore, as long as Richard Bull demolished the dock, the main force of the French army on the sea would be in a dilemma, attack, and they could only rely on individual waiting landing. Without the impact of the plate armor knights, those French soldiers who waded ashore would only become living targets for the English longbowmen. And it would be extremely difficult to retreat. Because the main fleet of the English ambushed would never let go of the main fleet of the French army. Therefore, the countermeasures discussed by Henry VII and Thomas Stanley and others were a foolproof plan. Even if Wallace's fleet failed to successfully hold back the French fleet, as long as Richard Bull's army dismantled the docks at Hastings Port, the same effect could be achieved. Although it is not ruled out that the French found docks elsewhere, it is absolutely impossible to find a dock as large as Hastings Port in a short time. Without so many long bridge docks, the French hundreds of transport ships could not land at all. The force of landing only a few ships is also easily repelled by Richard Bull's army that followed. It seems that Richard Bull had been prepared for a long time. The 10,000 British soldiers who were assigned to dismantle the docks, each of them brought a felling axe. The soldiers jumped into the water and began to chop at the wooden piles nailed into the water of the long bridge docks like cutting trees and logging. Many of the long bridge docks of this era were made of wood. That is, under the wooden plank bridges of later generations, solid wood such as logs were used to pile on the seabed to make a solid support frame. Its principle is no different from the wooden plank bridges with support piles seen in later generations. So, in the same way, as long as the supporting piles made of logs were cut off, the long bridge pier would collapse directly. The British soldiers worked hard with their woodcutters to look at the wooden piles supporting the wooden long bridge pier, while Abel, the French commander on the top of the city, was so angry that he almost had a heartache. However, he had no way. It was obvious that the British army had 20,000 troops. Even if half of them were divided to dismantle the pier, there were still 10,000 troops to guard against them. The 5,000 French troops in the city did not dare to go out of the city to fight. After all, they were all infantry and could not attack the British formation at all. Perhaps half of them would be shot and killed by the British longbowmen on the way. So, Abel could only cover his heart and helplessly watch the British soldiers on the pier happily dismantling the long bridge piers. The wooden long bridge pier was still easy to dismantle, as long as the supporting piles were cut. But Hastings Port, as one of the 5 major ports in the UK, was not only a wooden long bridge pier. Here, there are 5 permanent docks made of stones and bricks. Richard Bull was very troubled about how to dismantle this brick and stone dock. Because this kind of solid dock is too difficult to dismantle. Moreover, there is no time to dismantle it. If the French defeated Wallace's fleet, they might arrive soon, and the British army would not be allowed to dismantle it slowly. In the end, a low-ranking British officer who ran a ship at home gave Richard Bull an idea. Since the dock could not be dismantled, then it would be okay to make the dock unable to dock ships. The reason why the Long Bridge Wharf is deep in the sea is that a certain depth of water is required for ships to dock, otherwise, if the water is too shallow, the ship will easily run aground. Once such a heavy ship runs aground, it is difficult to deal with. Therefore, the idea given by the officer is to throw stones and bricks on the seabed around the Long Bridge Wharf so that the height of the debris is close to the water surface. It cannot be higher than the water surface, otherwise it can also be used as the Long Bridge Wharf. In this way, as long as the French ships dare to dock, they will be directly stranded on these stones and bricks thrown into the water. Richard Bull immediately adopted this good suggestion and sent his soldiers to collect stones and bricks around. In order to gather enough stones and bricks for land reclamation, Richard Bull even sent his soldiers to demolish the houses of many residents outside the city to obtain enough bricks and stones. With enough bricks and stones, the water around the 5 brick and stone Long Bridge docks was filled with bricks and stones about 1 meter above the water surface. This height makes ships most uncomfortable. Moreover, because the bricks and stones are thrown down randomly, the shape of the pile is irregular, which is not suitable for ships to dock. In this way, even if the French fleet comes, it will not be able to land. After solving the dock, Richard Bull is not in a hurry. Anyway, the French troops in the city will not grow wings and fly away, so why rush to attack? This is not France. Even if this group of French troops break out, they have nowhere to go. As long as the main force of the French army at sea is solved, these French troops will surrender in despair. So, the British army camped directly outside the city and waited for news. As for the French troops in the city, they only sent people to monitor them and prevent them from fighting desperately. Chapter 663, No Looking Back. The French did not know that the British had reinforcements, because the intelligence they received was that the people of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea and Edward had attracted the British fleet to the Irish Sea. Moreover, the French had previously conducted reconnaissance on the British side of the English Channel and did not find any large-scale British fleets. As for Wallace's fleet, the French did not care much, thinking that it was a resistance force that the British had urgently gathered. As a maritime country, it was not surprising that Britain could urgently gather so many ships. Moreover, Wallace's desperate blocking attitude was a bit like a trapped beast in the eyes of the French commander Valgery. Therefore, the French saw that the main force of the British fleet was surrounded, and they were not in a hurry to destroy the other side. The French offensive slowed down, and the English sailors were greatly relieved. In fact, the English did not want to fight desperately, because their mission was to delay the French fleet before the reinforcements arrived. If possible, they were not willing to risk their lives. The main thing was that British sailors were pirates in the eyes of the French, and they would die if they were caught. Therefore, no English sailors surrendered. Therefore, the French slowed down their attack, and the English sailors were actually relieved. So, they did not counterattack, but only resisted the French attack on the decks of the outer ships of the English fleet. As the sun was about to set, the French began to eat dinner in batches. Several hours of sea fighting was very physically demanding. At this time, a hungry sailor could eat a piece of black bread as big as a basin. Valgery knew that the soldiers were very tired and hungry, so he asked the soldiers to withdraw in batches to eat and drink water. After eating and drinking enough, they had enough physical strength to continue. However, in order to interfere with the British army's eating and resting and prevent the opponent from recovering their physical strength, the French army attacked in batches. One group went to eat, and the other group continued to attack, making the British army exhausted. This tactic seems to be effective. Because the British army had few people, they could not eat and drink in batches. If this continues, when the British army is too hungry, facing the well-fed French army, it will inevitably be a big rout. However, things did not develop as the French expected. They were well fed and ready to continue the attack. But just before the sun set, a sail suddenly appeared on the southwest sea. The top of the sail first appeared, and then the whole sail gradually appeared. Then, the hull appeared. With the glow of the setting sun, the French were surprised to find that there were about a few hundred ships on the southwest sea, led by 100 or so large ships. Who is coming? The French in the fleet thought. Because they didn't know the identity of the comers. Of course, they hoped that it was the reinforcements sent by the King of France. However, the ships mobilized by the King of France are basically here. If it is the British, it doesn't seem right. Because the intelligence received by the French is that the main fleet of the British is not at home. The French are still confused, but Sir Wallace, who has been observing the Southwest Sea on the top of the flagship stern, jumped up with joy. Although he only saw a sail, he knew that it was reinforcements coming. If reinforcements were coming, then Wallace wouldn't have to die in battle. He would get the title of Baron without dying, and he would also get the fiefdom. Just think about it, it's so cool. In his excitement, Wallace didn't forget to share with his men. Reinforcements are coming. We are going to win. The English sailors were tired and hungry, and were almost on the verge of collapse. The French on the opposite side, however, were well fed and well drinking, and it was clear that they were going to be finished. At this time, Wallace's words, "Reinforcements are coming," sounded like heavenly music to their ears. So, the English sailors also shouted enthusiastically. Reinforcements are coming. Reinforcements are coming. At the same time, their morale was greatly boosted. The French sailors on the opposite side didn't understand, but Count Valgeri was completely disappointed. He also saw the sail on the southwest sea, and was a little doubtful at first. Because the enemy ship came from the southwest French mainland, he was also a little unsure. But now he heard the shouts of the English sailors. He knew a little English. How could he not know that the sails were the reinforcements of the British army? At this time, he finally understood why the British fleet in front of him was trying so hard to hold them back, even if so many people died. It turned out that the other side was waiting for the reinforcements to encircle the French fleet from behind. Could it be, this is a trap of the British? But at this time, Count Valgeri had no time to think about it. He knew that if he didn't make a decision, the whole fleet would be finished. So he hurriedly ordered. Order it down, the whole army evacuates. Notify the transport fleet, all flee eastward, evacuate to the port of Calais. The messenger began to shout across the ship to convey the order. At the same time, several speedboats were lowered from the big ship and headed straight for the transport fleet, notifying the transport fleet to flee eastward. At this time, the English Channel was blowing westerly winds, and the British ambushing fleet came very quickly. Moreover, there were a lot of them. In addition to the 150 or so big ships in the front, there were hundreds of small boats following behind. The key is that they all seem to be warships. At this time, if the transport fleet opens its sails and flees eastward with the wind, many ships will be stopped. However, if hundreds of ships flee with the wind, there will always be some that slip through the net and reach the port of Calais. Now, that is the territory of the French. The French warships that originally surrounded the Wallace fleet also evacuated. However, the French ships in the innermost circle hooked the British ships with iron anchors, which not only restricted the British ships, but also their own ships. In desperation, Count Valgeri had to let the personnel on the dozen French ships in the inner circle evacuate the ships and board other French warships. When dozens of French main warships left the original battle group, Count Valgeri sadly discovered that some ships in the southwest part of the French fleet had been surrounded by British reinforcements. It looked like it was definitely going to be a disaster. Watching the British pirates ravaging the French transport ships, Valgeri's eyes were filled with tears. He knew that the French were finished this time. At this time, Valgeri began a fierce ideological struggle in his heart. He could see that the British were determined to destroy the French fleet. After this battle, the French would probably be unable to do anything at sea for at least a dozen years. However, he had two choices at the moment. One was to take advantage of the British fleet attacking the transport fleet, go around from the north side of the transport fleet to the east, and take the remaining dozens of warships to escape by himself. With the obstruction of those transport ships, the British wanted to stop the main French fleet, explaining that they could stop a part of it, but they would definitely be able to escape a lot. If this method was chosen, then the transport fleet would definitely be destroyed, but the main French fleet would definitely be able to save dozens of warships. Another option was to take these dozens of warships and go to stop the British fleet. Then, let the transport fleet escape. The transport fleet was carrying not only war horses and baggage, but also many French knights accompanying the war horses. These people are the essence of the French army. Especially these knights, they are the backbone of the French army. Each of them can be an officer. If they all die in this naval battle, then France will be finished. After all, it takes more than 10 years to train a knight. France dispatched 8,000 knights this time, which is almost the core essence of the French kingdom army. If they are finished, France will never recover. After thinking it over, the chivalry education that Count Valjery had received since childhood prevailed. I swear allegiance to Lord Louis, Duke of Orleans. I swear to be kind to the weak. I swear to bravely fight against powerful enemies. I swear to fight against all mistakes. I swear to fight for unarmed civilians. I swear to help anyone who asks me for help. I swear. In front of the royal palace of Orleans, the scene when Valjery swore allegiance to Louis XII, who was then the Duke of Orleans, once again appeared in front of Valjery. At that time, Valjery was still a young apprentice knight. He knelt in front of Louis, the Duke of Orleans, who was also young at the time, and swore to become a glorious knight. Recalling the past years, Count Valjery's tiger eyes were filled with tears. He looked up to the sky and roared. Your Majesty Louis, let me, Valjery, be loyal to you for the last time. After shouting this sentence, Valjery wiped away his tears. When he turned around, his eyes were like knives. Pass my order, all the remaining 82 warships are to meet the enemy head-on and stop the English main battleships. Anyone who shrinks back will be killed. Gentlemen, I will lead the loyal guard to charge in the front. Please charge with me. If I retreat, please chop off my head. For France. Count Valjery drew his knight's sword and shouted with all his strength. For France. The French sailors followed suit and shouted. Also, pass on my order, all transport ships carrying knights, flee eastward with all their might. Other transport ships, including those transporting artillery, should all be horizontally facing north and south to prevent British ships from chasing those transport ships carrying knights. After a pause, Count Valjery said to the messenger. Tell those knights that if the ship is overloaded and affects the speed, order them to push all the war horses into the sea. All the armor can be thrown away. Finally, tell them that only when people are alive can they continue to serve His Majesty Louis. War horses can be trained again, but people are the most precious. Warriors, follow me to charge and stop the British pirates. For the future of France, kill. After that, Count Valjery took the lead, standing on the bow, commanding the flagship, Loyal Guard, and rushed towards the main British fleet in the southwest without hesitation. Chapter 664, Defeat. Henry VII was ruthless this time and wanted to annihilate the French army. Therefore, this time he gave a death order to the commander of the main fleet, Baron Turnbull, except for those ships carrying grain and artillery, all other manned ships should be sunk, and no prisoners should be taken. This move was very vicious. If the enemy was captured, if the French paid, Henry VII had to abide by the rules and let the other party redeem the people. However, if these people were redeemed by the French, even if they lost money, as long as the people were still there, the French would still be a threat to Britain. Therefore, after discussing with his equally vicious stepfather, Earl Thomas Stanley, Henry VII decided to burn the French ships, including the people and the ships. Let the enemy either die in the sea of fire or sink into the sea with the ship. In this way, the French will lose a lot of elites. Although not capturing them will lose a lot of ransom, Henry VII cares about the safety of England, not the ransom. Therefore, as long as the French soldiers were burned to death or sunk into the sea with the ship, then even if the French were willing to pay, they would not be able to redeem those soldiers. It takes more than 10 or 20 years to train a knight or officer. During this period of time, the French will never recover. As for the French accusations afterwards, so what? Just say that the French soldiers are good and refuse to surrender. Can you still fish out the bodies of the French soldiers who sank into the sea and confront them in court? Based on the order of Henry VII, after surrounding several transport ships in the southwest corner of the French fleet, General Turnbull saw that they were all manned. Without saying a word, he asked his men to fire rockets and set all the ships on fire. It was too late to put out the fire. Then, General Turnbull smiled cruelly and watched several French ships sink into the sea. Even if the French officers on the French ships were willing to surrender, he did not accept it. Some French soldiers who jumped into the sea were also shot to death with longbows by his order. Just as he dealt with several French transport ships in the southwest and prepared to continue eastward, 82 French main battleships led by Count Valjery arrived. These French warships lined up and blocked the British fleet. Ha! I was just about to find you, but I didn't expect to be sent to your door. General Turnbull sneered. He knew very well that as long as the warship formation in front of him was destroyed, the French navy would be finished. Because the thousands of sailors who were good at fighting trained by the French for the navy were all in this fleet. As long as this fleet was destroyed, the French navy would become history. Shoot! Turnbull ordered. Suddenly, the English longbowmen in the fleet shot out one after another, and the rockets fell on the French warships like raindrops. Of course, this was not very useful, because there were enough sailors on these large ships. In addition, the fleet was not surrounded, and the sailors still had time to put out the fire when the arrows did not come from all directions. Even the entire sail was soaked with seawater by the sailors, making it difficult to ignite. The same was true on the deck, which was covered with water. The French fleet just wanted to stop the other side, and did not take the initiative to move forward, but just stopped there. When the British shot arrows, except for the sailors who carried wooden boards to avoid the arrows and were busy putting out the fire. The other sailors hid in the cabin. Even Count Valjery, who had just stood at the bow to boost morale, temporarily retreated into the captain's room to avoid the rain of arrows. Therefore, although the British arrows rained down on the French warships, except for some unlucky sailors who were hit by arrows while putting out the fire, everyone else hid, and naturally did not suffer too much damage. At the same time, to the east of the transport fleet, 30 or 40 small English warships were still harassing the French transport ships fleeing eastward. At this time, it was probably the last order of Count Valjery that was conveyed. Some ships transporting food and supplies rushed forward without hesitation, blocking those small English warships, and bought enough time to cover the ships carrying the knights to retreat eastward. Because they were full of war horses, weapons, armor and knights, the transport ships carrying knights were not fast. It can be imagined that when the French transport ships carrying food and supplies were eliminated by the 30 or 40 small English warships, the ships carrying knights and war horses could not escape either. At this time, on the ships carrying knights, war horses and other supplies, the knights were arguing fiercely. "Frank, what are you doing?" a knight shouted at another knight with red eyes. According to the order of Count Valjery, in order to increase the speed of the ship, push all the war horses into the sea. The knight named Frank said expressionlessly. "You bastard! Don't you know that a warhorse is a knight's second life? Without a warhorse, what are we knights? Infantrymen in plate armor. Barrett, don't you understand? A fully loaded ship can't run fast. If the speed is too slow, we can't escape at all. Why should we escape? We are knights, fearless knights." The knight named Barrett retorted with his neck stiff. "Fool, do you know what you are doing?" Knight Frank pointed to the warships that were facing the rain of arrows from the British army in the west and shouted. In order to cover our retreat, Lord Count Valjery personally led the fleet to stop the British pirates. Why did he disregard his own life like this? It was for us to return to France safely. Without us knights, the French army would exist in name only. We can't let Count Valjery and his men die in vain. Foolish, do you understand? But we can't abandon the warhorses that have been with us for many years. They are our best partners. Knight Barrett retorted in a low voice. I know you feel bad, and so do I. My Siri, the name of the warhorse, has been with me for 8 years, and I have long regarded it as a family member. But, in order for us to survive, I want to push it into the sea with my own hands. But I have to do this. Before he finished speaking, Knight Frank was already in tears. After wiping away his tears, Knight Frank untied the reins of his warhorse and led the horse to the edge of the deck. After hugging and kissing his warhorse, Frank let out a desperate cry. Ah! He exerted force suddenly and pushed his beloved warhorse into the sea. Siri, I'm sorry. But, for France, I have to do this. Frank knelt on the deck with tears in his eyes, watching his warhorse floundering in the sea, desperate and helpless. Although the horse can swim, there is no landing place in this vast ocean. Even if it can swim, the horse pushed into the sea will die of exhaustion. Now, what knight Frank hopes most is that the British ship can salvage his warhorse. At least, his horse could be kept alive. With the lead of Knight Frank, the other knights also silently led their horses and came to the edge of the deck. After bidding farewell to their horses, these knights, with tears in their eyes, shouted desperately, and pushed their most beloved horses into the sea. Men don't shed tears easily, just because they are not sad. Now, in order to escape, the knights need to push their horses, who depend on each other for life and death, into the sea with their own hands. How tormenting is this for their hearts? Many knights who are as strong as mountains knelt on the deck and cried like a tearful man. The horses are attached to their masters. Even if they are pushed into the sea, they still paddle hard and swim to chase the ship that their masters are on. However, after throwing away the horses and some unnecessary baggage, the ships became much lighter. Following the westerly wind, the ships went farther and farther, leaving the wailing of the horses over the sea. At this time, on the west side of the battlefield. After discovering that archery was ineffective, General Turnbull, the commander-in-chief of the English fleet, became impatient. So, after the ships of both sides approached, a large number of English sailors carrying sailor scimitars either jumped on board or boarded the deck of the French warship through ropes. Count Valjery's original intention was not to fight the British army, which had an absolute advantage, but to delay the other side. Therefore, the French sailors retreated into the cabin and resisted stubbornly. After Turnbull found that he could not take the French warship down after a long attack, he directly asked the English sailors who boarded the French warship to set fire to the ship. Seeing the ship burning, the sailors who put out the fire on the deck were cleared by the British army. In desperation, Count Valjery had to rush out with the French sailors and fight with the English sailors. In the end, the French sailors were outnumbered and died one after another. The British army originally wanted to capture the big fish of Count Valjery alive, but Count Valjery refused to surrender. After being stabbed several times, the loyal Earl fell powerlessly on the deck. Before he died, he looked at the south affectionately and refused to close his eyes. In the end, this naval battle ended with the complete defeat of the French. The powerful fleet of hundreds of ships that the French had painstakingly prepared was completely destroyed by the British. As for the large-scale transport fleet, most of them were captured by the British. Many transport ships carrying infantry were directly sunk into the sea by the British army with people and ships. Only a group of transport ships carrying knights took advantage of the chaos and fled to the east under the desperate cover of other ships. The British could not catch up with those ships, so they had to salvage the war horses of the French knights who were tired of swimming and took them back as trophies. But no matter what, the French suffered a great defeat this time. Not only was the French navy annihilated, but also lost a count who was a confidant of the King of France. With the large amount of food, supplies, artillery and other supplies, the British can be said to have made a fortune. Chapter 665, After the War. Pa 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 pa. It was not the sound of applause, nor the sound of that, but Wallace's adjutant Jackson was slapped by Turnbull, the commander-in-chief of the English fleet. Jackson's face was swollen on both sides, but Turnbull still didn't want to let him go. "You idiot, why didn't you intercept the ship carrying the French knights?" "Huh." General Turnbull slapped him twice more and continued to roar. "I told you to salvage the warhorse. I told you to salvage the warhorse." After the beating, General Turnbull pointed at Jackson's nose and cursed. "Are you a pig? French knights are more important or warhorses are more important? You didn't chase the noble French knights, but stopped the ship to salvage the warhorse. I've never seen such a short-sighted officer like you." General Turnbull was almost mad. Jackson's 40 small warships were the only British forces on the east side of the French fleet at that time. If Jackson had fought back and stopped those ships full of knights fleeing to Calais, then this time, England could have killed at least a few thousand French knights. As long as these thousands of French knights died, the French army would not be able to recover for many years. Because those French knights who were highly skilled in martial arts and literate were the backbone of the French army. Drowning them in the sea was equivalent to breaking the backbone of the French army. It would take the French 10 or 8 years to recover. If the powerful enemies of the French, such as Spain and the Habsburg family, took the opportunity to send troops at this time, it was possible that France would be crippled. However, the idiot named Jackson in front of him could not run when he saw the war horses pushed into the sea by the French knights. A war horse was worth hundreds of gold coins. The French pushed thousands of war horses into the sea, and the sea was full of the cries of war horses. In the eyes of Jackson, who came from a merchant family, it was not more than 7,000 war horses, but more than 700,000 golden coins. So, out of his merchant nature, in order to prevent the war horses from drowning due to exhaustion, Jackson quickly ordered his men to salvage the war horses. When General Turnbull defeated the French fleet led by Count Valjery who blocked the road, he arrived with the main fleet and found that Jackson was working hard to salvage the war horses with his ships. Turnbull was directly furious. At this time, the ship carrying the French knights that fled to the east had already run far away and could not be caught up. After all, everyone was a cog sailing ship. The other side had run so long, and they had thrown away the war horses and a lot of baggage and went into battle lightly. It was impossible for the main fleet to catch up with them. Before that, if Jackson's fleet, which was already on the east side of the battlefield, could have pinned down those ships, at least half of the French knights could have been killed when the main force arrived. But the unlucky Jackson had no overall view. When he saw the valuable war horses, he went directly to fish for the horses and didn't care about chasing the French knights' ships. When the main British fleet arrived, it was too late. General Turnbull, who was furious, caught Jackson and beat him up, but he still didn't get rid of his hatred. Captain Jackson was actually very aggrieved. "I fished up so many gold coins, why did you beat me? This is more than 700,000 gold coins. This really can't be blamed on Jackson." Jackson was born in a civilian merchant family and was only Wallace's deputy. He could only be regarded as a low-level officer. How could he have the strategic vision of the top? Seeing the gold coins swimming in the sea, it would be strange if Jackson didn't move. Moreover, most of the mercenaries of this era would make the same choice as Jackson. For example, Charles VIII did this in the Battle of Fornovo between Charles VIII and the Italian coalition. In order to prevent his army from being entangled by the enemy, Charles VIII ordered most of the treasures looted from the Kingdom of Naples to be scattered on the two wings of the French army, and then led his army to retreat. The 6,000 cavalrymen of the Italian coalition, who were originally responsible for outflanking the French flank, saw the treasures all over the ground and did not care about chasing the French army. They all dismounted to pick up gold and silver treasures. Then, the French army evacuated the battlefield safely. Count Valjery ordered the knights to push the horses into the sea. In addition to reducing the burden on the transport ships, it was also intended to attract the attention of the British army. After all, this was also learned from the previous French king. Unexpectedly, this trick worked really well. Jackson's fleet, which was originally responsible for intercepting the French transport ships that had left the fleet, immediately forgot about the pursuit after seeing the valuable French war horses on the sea, and directly led his men to salvage the war horses. Because his fleet was small and could not carry so many war horses, after the main British fleet arrived, Jackson foolishly called on friendly warships to salvage the French war horses together. Not to mention, many English grassroots officers and ordinary sailors were tempted. Turnbull saw that he could not catch up with the French night transport ship team whose sails could not be seen, and he had no choice but to let the fleet go to salvage the French war horses. After all, this was also captured, and the bulk of the captured horses. However, as the instigator, Jackson was inevitably beaten up. Moreover, when it comes to meritorious service after the war, Jackson can forget about being rewarded, and it was luck that he was not punished. However, the supplies seized by the English fleet this time were really rich. The French were defeated this time, leaving behind more than 7,000 knights' horses, hundreds of bronze cannons, and countless food and fodder for supplying 20,000 troops and more than 10,000 civilians, a total of more than 30,000 people, as well as more than 7,000 horses. Seeing these shiploads of food and fodder, Turnbull understood that the French had prepared the food and fodder needed for the English army's northern expedition, and there was even a lot left over. In addition, Turnbull also seized more than 90 large French warships, including those that were hooked, and hundreds of French transport ships. Originally, this fleet still had several thousand French infantrymen, but in the previous battle, most of them were ordered by Turnbull to send the ships and people to the sea. Now, in addition to the rich supplies, the fleet only has less than 2,000 surrendered French prisoners and more than 6,000 French civilians. Turnbull originally planned to kill all the French soldiers, but after knowing that the French knights had all escaped, he stopped the massacre of those French infantrymen. Because, that was meaningless. Henry VII wanted to kill those French knights who were the backbone of the French army, not those infantrymen. Infantrymen can be recruited from the people, and training for 2 or 3 years is very good. Knights are different. They need to be trained for more than 10 years and a lot of investment is required. Therefore, for those infantrymen, it doesn't matter whether they are killed or not. Because, what France lacks the least is people. Just catch some strong men from the people to train, and there will be another large group of infantrymen. Only by killing those knights can France be seriously injured. So, after counting the results of the battle, General Turnbull returned with his fleet in a daze. The reason why he was so uninterested was that he knew that he had not met Henry VII's requirements this time. Although he had made some contributions, it was still far worse than killing all the French knights. According to the previous explanation of the Minister of the Navy Johnson, if he could kill all the French knights, he might be promoted to Earl. Now, this is unlikely. So, he was uninterested. Sure enough, when Henry VII learned of the results of the battle, he was happy but not very excited. For Turnbull, who commanded the fleet to victory, Henry VII only rewarded some money and fiefdoms. As for the promotion to the title, he didn't even mention it. As for the unfortunate Jackson, he was still a civilian and did not become a nobleman because of his military exploits. Because the mistakes he made were enough to offset any of his merits. Wallace, who led his men to fight, was awarded the title of Baron because he had entangled the French fleet. However, due to the burden of his adjutant Jackson, Wallace's fiefdom was only 600 acres, which was about the same size as a knight's territory. Because he failed to catch the French knights, Henry VII was too lazy to harm the surrendered French infantry. As for those infantrymen, Henry VII locked them up and waited for Louis XII to send someone to redeem them with money. In Hastings, when Turnbull and his men dragged the captured French ships to the vicinity of Hastings Harbor, Abel, the French commander of Hastings, knew that the situation was over and simply surrendered. Because the 5,000 French infantry he led had become completely isolated and had no hope. There was no other choice but to surrender. Henry VII did not make it difficult for him. They were just infantrymen anyway, and it would be good to exchange them with Louis XII for some pocket money. As for the captured French military supplies and a large number of war horses, Henry VII was also very happy. So many supplies, and more than 7,000 strong French war horses, were definitely a huge fortune, equivalent to England's fiscal revenue for several years. How could Henry VII not be happy? Chapter 666 Hiding in Marin's Camp. After dealing with the French, the next step was to completely solve the problem of Edward. So, Henry VII ordered General Turnbull to lead half of the warships to block the Irish Sea and completely block Edward's retreat to the island of Ireland. Then, it was to completely eliminate Edward's forces on the British Isles. However, Henry VII was also worried that Edward would flee to Scotland north of Hadrian's Wall after his defeat. Edward himself had 10,000 people, and Scotland also had more than 10,000 people. The combination of the two would be difficult to deal with. And as far as Henry VII knew, most of Edward's troops were French mercenaries. In order to trick Edward, Henry VII sent an envoy to France to demand a ransom for the prisoners of war, and ordered the waiter to deliberately reveal that it was Edward's people who told Henry VII the secret of the French sending troops. In this way, the French, who suffered a huge loss, would definitely be furious. If France sent a small boat to the Irish Sea at that time, the English fleet would pretend to turn a blind eye. This is because the furious French would send an envoy to tell the thousands of French mercenaries who worked for Edward. Maybe Edward's army was in chaos first. Most of Edward's army were French, that is, the so-called mercenaries sent by Louis XII. But they were actually the regular French army, and Edward had only 2,000 or 3,000 non-French soldiers. If intelligence came from France that Edward had betrayed France and caused France to suffer heavy losses, then those French soldiers would definitely be alienated from Edward and might even have internal strife. Just based on those 2,000 or 3,000 non-French soldiers, Henry VII could tell with his toes that the other side would definitely be finished. Henry VII's strategy was insidious and vicious. If Edward really relied heavily on French soldiers, he would definitely be finished if he used this strategy. However, Henry VII didn't know that Edward had already connected with Marin. Now, Edward had already taken his army to Marin. After bloodbathing Lancashire, the old nest of the Lancastrians, Edward did not stop and led his army directly eastward into Yorkshire. Yorkshire was naturally the base camp of the York family. When Edward entered Yorkshire with the white rose flag, he was welcomed by many Yorkshire people who were still staying here. Although Yorkshire suffered a severe famine due to the looting of the Scottish army, and more than half of the people fled south to escape famine. But since last year, many Yorkshire people have returned to their homeland, bought seeds with their savings, and continued to farm. However, because this is the base of the York family, King Henry VII of England even hoped that Yorkshire would collapse completely. Therefore, the British royal family did not care about the life and death of Yorkshire last year. Of course, they could not care about the life and death of other northern counties, except for Lancashire and Chestershire, the base of the Lancastrian faction. The people of Yorkshire naturally support the York dynasty, not the Lancaster dynasty, let alone the Tudor dynasty. Therefore, after entering Yorkshire, Edward was warmly welcomed by the locals. Then, surrounded by local celebrities, Edward's army entered York, the centre of Yorkshire. Then, Marin, who got the news, also led 20,000 troops from the mountains and forests in the south of Northumberland, south along the Pennines, and arrived at the mountains and forests west of the York Valley where York City is located. However, there was no public appearance. The reason for this was that Marin had his own considerations. He believed that although his army was not weaker than the British army. However, after the French were pitted, it was unknown whether the French army under Edward would continue to help Edward fight. Therefore, his 20,000 troops must be prepared to take on the task of fighting against the main force of the English army. Of course, the army dominated by the French was still somewhat useful. For example, they could attract most of the attention of the English army. Marin believed that York, the capital of Yorkshire, was the key to this war. As the heir to the York dynasty, Edward had no problem staying in York. And Henry VII would definitely march north after cleaning up the French army. And the York Valley where York City was located was a good battlefield. If Edward's 10,000 troops, mainly French, were stationed in York, attracting the British army to surround it. While the British army was surrounding York, his own army suddenly rushed out from the Pennines and attacked the back of the English army. The probability of victory would be higher. In addition, when the French were pitted, Marin was very worried about the safety of Edward and his family. Of course, the most important thing was the safety of Edward's daughter Margaret. If the French soldiers under Edward found out something and finally mutinied, Edward and his family would be in danger. You know, Edward himself was somewhat repulsive to the French. After landing with his army, Edward only brought his wife Anna and daughter Margaret, as well as some of his own confidants. As for Anna's servants from France who originally accompanied her, Edward did not bring any of them, leaving them all in Dublin. This move was hard not to arouse the suspicion of Edward's French soldiers. Because, without those French servants, it became difficult for the French soldiers to obtain some private information from Edward. If the news of the French defeat in the English Channel came again at this time, perhaps some French soldiers would react and suspect Edward. Therefore, Edward and his family are now in danger. So, Marin sent someone to secretly send a letter to Edward, telling him that in order to prevent the French soldiers from finding something rebelling, Edward and his family had better come to Marin's army and accept the protection of the army of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. After receiving Marin's letter, Edward was still a little hesitant. Because he didn't trust Marin very much. However, when he received a secret letter from his sister, Princess Margaret, he immediately changed his mind and took his wife Anna and daughter Margaret to hide in Marin's camp in the Pennines. Princess Margaret told her brother in the secret letter that Henry VII deliberately told the French that it was Edward who leaked the whereabouts of the French army. If the French army in York received this news, wouldn't they chop Edward's whole family? They were all sent by Louis XII. So Edward decided to run away decisively. As for York City, Edward handed it over to the French commander François. Before leaving, while the French in York City were still unaware, he had conspired with Marin long ago. Edward told François to continue to defend York City in his name and attract the British army to attack. And Edward would lead the army to attack the British army from the side and rear after the British army besieged the city, in order to achieve the goal of one battle to decide the outcome. In order to fool François, Edward promised that if he won this battle, once he became the King of England, he would confer François the Earl of England and have the actual fiefdom of a county in England. The big pie that Edward drew really fooled the French commander, Knight François, a little bit lost. Even, he had the idea of leaving the King of France and following Edward. After all, the King of France promised only a baron. But Edward was more generous and gave him an earl. Moreover, there was a powerful earl of a county fiefdom. So, Knight Francois promised Edward that he would definitely guard York City and wait to attack the invading British army from both inside and outside with Edward. After fooling the French, Edward took his wife and daughter and hid in Marin's secret camp in the Pennines, waiting for the arrival of the English army. In this way, Edward and Marin met in victory. That's not right, it should be that Edward's whole family hid in Marin's camp. Chapter 667, Who is the best at blaming others? Marin was surprised that Edward's family moved to her camp without many guards. Although she had suggested it to Edward, he was a little puzzled that he really moved here. After all, Edward was no longer the young man who had just been rescued from the Tower of London, and he would not trust others so easily. So, when drinking at night, taking advantage of the opportunity of being half drunk and half awake, Marin asked tentatively. "Your Majesty, why did you really come to my camp? Don't you want York City?" Edward said with a bitter face. "I don't want to either. Damn Henry, after defeating the French, deliberately told the French that I leaked the French intelligence to them. If the French soldiers under my command knew about it, wouldn't they tear me down?" Edward Manchester United said bitterly. "Is the news reliable?" Marin asked with a serious face. "Of course it is reliable," Edward said without hesitation. Marin understood immediately, this must be the information from Edward's sister, Princess Margaret. However, Marin changed his mind and became happy. If that's the case, my suspicion is cleared. In this way, Louis XII won't suspect me. Edward immediately said dissatisfiedly. "You are not suspected, but I am miserable. In this way, Louis XII will want to eat me?" Marin said nonchalantly. "Your Majesty, you will become the King of England in the future. As the King of England, you are a natural enemy of France. What do you have to worry about?" Edward nodded, but soon shook his head and said. "That's true, but the timing is wrong. I have 7,000 or 8,000 French soldiers under my command. Originally, they were my strong support in attacking Henry, the regicide. But if the French misunderstand me, then they will instantly become my mortal enemy. They may even help Henry to attack me. Since they are both mortal enemies, Louis XII must hate me, a possible traitor, even more." After listening, Marin nodded and agreed. It seems that Edward has indeed grown a lot over the years. Unlike when he just came out of the Tower of London, he was just a rookie. After thinking for a while, Marin said. "Although I did this, I can never admit it. You know, Your Majesty, my Grand Duchy of the North Sea is on land. And France is the strongest army in Europe. If Louis XII is angry with me, my Grand Duchy of the North Sea will be finished. Moreover, I did this for the good of England. After all, if the French forces really landed on the British Isles, it would be extremely difficult to drive them away. I even suspect that the French want to annex England." Edward took a sip of red wine and nodded. "Yes, I am sure that the French have ambitions to annex England. After all, for more than 100 years, the King of England has called himself the King of France, and the King of France has called himself the Monarch of England. To be honest, I am not afraid of offending the French. But this is not the right time. If I had occupied London, I wouldn't care even if I killed all those 7,000 or 8,000 French soldiers. But at this juncture, it is easy for that French army to become our enemy. How about my army enter York City, and then attack the French at night and kill them all?" Marin suggested. Edward shook his head and said. "Not appropriate, it would be better if we can continue to use the French army to fight Henry. In this way, it's a dog-eat-dog battle, and I won't feel sorry for whoever loses." After hearing this, Marin held his chin and said casually. "So, I'll think of a way for you." 10 minutes later, Marin suddenly woke up and asked. "Your Majesty, are there any of your guards who asked for leave to go home after landing in England?" "What do you mean?" Edward was a little puzzled. Marin said confidently. "Think about whether you have gone home to see your family. Most of Edward's men were French, and the others were German mercenaries. But there were also many people who opposed Henry VII who followed Edward. They were all the old and young of the York family, or the enemies of Henry VII. At the beginning, they were all exiled in France. When Edward was exiled to France, these people gathered around Edward. Of course, many of them were civil officials, not all combatants. There were also many people who served as Edward's guards. After all, Edward trusted his compatriots more than those who were obviously sent by Louis XII. There were dozens of English exiles who served as Edward's guards. After thinking for a while, Edward said, "When I was in Chester County, because I had no intention of going south to fight immediately, at that time, several guards did ask me for leave, saying that they wanted to go home and have a look." "That's great." Marin slammed the table and said excitedly. "Why?" Edward was a little confused. So Marin told Edward a story. The protagonist of the story was called Chowmunda. When this guy was conquering a vassal named Yuan Shu, the 170,000 troops were short of food. What? 170,000 troops? Are you kidding? Edward was shocked. 170,000 troops are not fictional. In that country in the east, hundreds of thousands of troops can be mobilized at will. Edward was shocked when he heard it. 170,000 troops, just the food and grass can drag down a monarch like the King of France. The East is not short of food. Marin said, but he did not tell the East why the grain output is higher than that of Europe. That is a technical topic and a secret. Of course, this is not true. Ancient Chinese agricultural technology is indeed much more advanced than that of Europe, but grain production is also limited. In times of war, the army's food is often forcibly taken from the hands of ordinary people. Therefore, even if the people grow food during war, they will be plundered, and eventually they will inevitably starve to death. Therefore, once a chaotic world comes, the population will drop sharply. Marin continued to describe. Seeing that the army was in a state of uncertainty due to the lack of food, a mutiny would occur if they were not careful. So, Chowmunda came up with a vicious plan: borrow the head of a grain officer. Then, the unlucky warehouse officer named Wang Ho, who was in charge of food, was killed by Chowmunda. Chowmunda displayed Wang Ho's head to the public and lied to the soldiers that he had embezzled military food and had been killed by me. Then, the army's morale stabilized. But, after killing the quartermaster named Wang Ho, the 170,000 troops are still short of food. Edward said, puzzled. Who cares? You're right. But those soldiers don't understand. They thought that if Wang Ho was killed, there would be no shortage of food. In addition, their resentment was gone and they would not mutiny again. There is a head for every grievance, and there is an owner for every debt. As long as the person responsible is found and punished, everyone's resentment can be eliminated. Edward nodded and said, I understand. You mean, you want me to borrow the head of a guard who went home to visit his family to calm the anger of the French? Yes, that's what I mean. Especially the one who is visiting his relatives in the south. You should directly put the blame on him and say that he is a spy sent by Henry VII who leaked the plan and caused the defeat of the French army. In this way, those French soldiers will not resent you. I understand. Edward began to recall with his head down. After a while, he suddenly raised his head and said, I remember that a guard named Allen under my command lives in Worcestershire in the south. Before, when our army was stationed in Chestershire, this guy went home to visit his relatives. Moreover, this person is not my absolute confidant. Marin nodded. Very good, the scapegoat has been found, and now it's time to take action. The next day, Marin brought 5,000 elite soldiers and accompanied Edward back to York. After returning to York, Edward immediately ordered the arrest of the guard Allen, and questioned in front of many French officers. Allen, why did you betray me? Edward looked disappointed. Marin secretly gave a thumbs up. Good acting. Originally, Marin and Edward thought that Allen would be confused, and then, they would kill Allen with a knife before Allen's guards could react, creating a fait accompli. But what the two did not expect was that the guard Allen was actually frightened and stammered. Your Majesty. Your Majesty, how did you know? What? Now it was Marin and Edward's turn to be confused. Originally, I just wanted to find a scapegoat, but I didn't expect to catch a spy. But Marin quickly reacted. Finding Allen, although he must have betrayed Edward, he confessed so easily, he should still be a novice. Moreover, this kind of setback would not really know Edward's real plan. Marin was right. When Allen went home to visit his relatives, he happened to be caught by Henry VII's men who went to the countryside to collect grain. Then, Alan, who couldn't stand the torture, told some secrets of Edward's army. However, because he was not Edward's confidant, he naturally didn't know the real secrets. For example, he didn't know the existence of Marin's army. Later, officers under Henry VII held Alan's family hostage, forcing Alan to return to Edward to continue to be a spy and provide intelligence for Henry VII's army. Unexpectedly, not long after returning, he was caught by Edward. And, unfortunately, this was purely an accident. Marin felt that it was enough. If he continued to interrogate, it would probably not be the result they wanted. So, after he winked at Edward's trusted guard Kira raised his knife angrily and chopped. "You bastard, let you betray His Majesty." Then, Alan was chopped to death. In the end, Edward told the French officers who were still unaware in a sad tone it was all this guy's fault. In the name of going home to visit relatives, he leaked our army's plan to the pseudo-King Henry. Then, Henry made preparations and transferred all the fleets in the Irish Sea to the English Channel to defeat the French fleet. The French officers saw Alan admit that he had leaked the intelligence with their own eyes, so they naturally had to believe it. Moreover, they didn't know how much France lost in this naval battle. If they knew that the French army was almost wiped out, they would probably be unable to resist whipping Alan's corpse. 3 days later, due to Henry VII's deliberate omission, the French envoy landed in Liverpool, crossed the Pennines, and came to York City to inform the French soldiers of the bad news. Originally, the envoy wanted the French soldiers to turn against Edward. But Edward asked the guard Alan to take the blame, and Alan admitted the betrayal on the spot. So, in the end, the French soldiers did not blame Edward, and decided to help Edward defeat Henry VII, the evil monarch who massacred the French. After the matter was successfully resolved, Marin hummed a tune in Chinese. Who is the best to blame? Dongshan Jiqing finds, Tang, Guiqiang. Chapter 668, Counter-Espionage. After the exposure of guard Alan, Marin began to pay attention to whether there were still enemy spies around Edward. So, Marin sent hundreds of scouts at night to monitor the gates of York City and the road to the south. After a few nights, he found several more spies. These spies originally planned to go south to report the new situation. The new situation is that 5,000 troops appeared near York City to support Edward. These 5,000 people were naturally brought into York City by Marin. And the spies who were caught were also beheaded for public display. In the following days, no one went out of the city to the south. Marin estimated that there were still spies around Edward, but after the previous events, it was estimated that they would not have the courage to pass on information to the outside in the short term. And Marin did not want to kill all the spies. As long as they did not reveal the secret of their army's existence to Henry VII in a short period of time, after this period of time, they defeated Henry VII's army. Even if Henry VII knew it, it would be too late. In Paris, France, Louis XII had been ill for 10 days and was still not getting better. 10 days ago, when the French knights who fled to Calais brought him the bad news that the fleet was defeated and most of the knights escaped, the rest were not spared. Louis XII was so angry that he vomited blood on the spot and then fell into a coma. The guards hurriedly sent Louis XII to the ship back to Paris and found a large group of royal doctors to treat him. Poor French court doctors, their level was only slightly higher than that of bloodletting doctors. Although Louis XII's condition did not worsen, it did not improve either. Originally, Louis XII had woken up a few days ago and was getting better. But the British envoy came to demand the ransom and, inadvertently, revealed that the reason why the British fleet could arrive at the battlefield in time was because Edward leaked information to Henry VII. So, Louis XII, who had just woken up, was so angry that he vomited blood again. Before falling into a coma, the angry Louis XII ordered to send an envoy to the north of England to inform the 7,000 or 8,000 French troops serving Edward to rebel against Edward. With the connivance of the British army, the envoy quickly arrived in York, where Edward was. But unexpectedly, Edward had already dealt with those French officers and soldiers by borrowing the head of the guard Alan. Then, the envoy had to bring back Edward's conclusion that Alan betrayed me. Then, Louis XII, who had just woken up, fainted again. A group of French court doctors were dumbfounded. How could His Majesty faint so easily? Was he possessed by evil spirits? Unable to think of a good solution, this group of court doctors found a group of priests, surrounded Louis XII's bed, and danced. In London, Henry VII was also waiting for news. Before, he deliberately let the French envoys land to find Edward's army, hoping that those French soldiers would revolt. Edward's army was mainly composed of the French army. If those French soldiers revolted and killed Edward, it would be over, and Henry VII would not have to send troops. But Henry VII waited and waited, but did not wait for the news of the mutiny in York. On the contrary, there was no intelligence from the few nails that had been planted in Edward's army before. Alas, it seems that all the spies have been cleared out. After hearing this, the shrewd Thomas Stanley sighed. Why do you say that? Maybe those spies were mistakenly killed by the rioting French army. Henry VII was puzzled. Impossible. Thomas Stanley shook his head. With the cleverness of those spies, if a riot broke out, they would obviously not protect Edward to the death, but would only escape for their own lives. In these days, there should be one who escaped to report the news, right? But no one escaped. So, I think someone must have been exposed. Maybe all of them were killed, maybe some of them were killed, and the others were temporarily frightened. In short, I'm afraid it will be difficult for us to obtain intelligence in a short time. Is Edward so smart? Henry VII was a little unconvinced. Edward had been imprisoned by him for more than 10 years and had never received a proper aristocratic education. Even if he was a little smart, it would be difficult for him to be so smart. After all, who would have thought that he would plant spies around him? Some of the so-called anti-Henry VII people in exile in France were deliberately sent there by Henry VII. But with the level of thinking of Europeans at that time, it should not be obvious. After all, Henry VII and his sinister stepfather were the most cunning combination in Europe at that time. Maybe, the problem lies with the French envoy. Thomas Stanley said leisurely after drinking the legendary Earl Grey milk tea. French envoy? Henry VII was a little puzzled. Maybe we all guessed wrong. The French envoy did not go to incite the French soldiers under Edward to rebel, but to appease them. Moreover, he also notified Edward to find the mole. This was Thomas Stanley's speculation. Are the French so smart? Henry VII did not believe it. Don't underestimate the smartness of Louis XII. Thomas Stanley demonized Louis XII in his heart. He didn't know about Marin's existence, so he could only push it to Louis XII, who seemed to be smarter at ordinary times. Louis XII was indeed smarter at ordinary times, but this time the French army almost lost all their underwear in the English Channel, and they were all so angry that they fainted. How could they calm down and think about the problem? However, Thomas Stanley thought too much and thought that Louis XII was so powerful. Henry VII thought about it, but couldn't come up with a better explanation, so he could only accept Thomas Stanley's words. In York City, Marin and Edward were also deducing the British Army's thoughts and intentions at this time. The main force of the British Army is about 20,000 people. The commander. I guess it's your brother-in-law Richard Bull. Marin said, and looked at Edward. Edward nodded and said. Indeed, my brother-in-law is also a more impressive commander under Henry. Although he is not as brilliant as you, he is also one of the best commanders under the pseudo-King Henry. The best commander? Marin's eyes flashed. Yes, it stands to reason that Thomas Stanley, the old fox, is more suitable to be the commander, but the old fox is old and his body can't meet the requirements of commanding troops. Therefore, Richard Bull is the first general under the pseudo-King Henry. Edward said affirmatively. I have a way. I can make Henry not dare to let Richard Bull be the commander. You say, if Richard Bull is not the commander-in-chief, will the enemy's combat effectiveness decrease? That's for sure. But how can you make Henry not trust Richard Bull? He is Henry's diehard. Of course I have a way. So, Marin came up with the counter-espionage plan, one of the 36 strategies. Although Richard Bull is Henry's confidant, he is also your brother-in-law, right? Edward nodded. Everyone in the world knew about this. Then, we can write a letter to Richard Bull, play the family card, and promise that as long as he leads the army to join you and kill Henry, he will be named the Duke of York. Marin said confidently. But Richard Bull is Henry's diehard, he will definitely not agree. The letter may be handed directly to Henry by him. I know, so I didn't plan to give the letter to Richard Bull, but to someone else, deliberately letting it fall into the hands of Henry VII. Marin smiled obscenely. After a long time, Edward finally said. You are so cunning. Chapter 669, Unfortunately I don't believe you. Marin's counter-espionage plan was very simple, that is, to let Edward promise Richard Pole, his brother-in-law, in a letter that as long as he was willing to lead the army to surrender to him, he would be canonized as the real Duke of Yorkshire. It can be said that the conditions offered by Edward were very generous. Because Yorkshire is the largest county in England. During the York dynasty, the Duke of York was only given to the king's own son. To be actually canonized as the Duke of York is equivalent to giving Yorkshire to him as a hereditary territory, which is full of sincerity. You know, although Henry VII married Princess Margaret to Richard Pole, Princess Margaret's title was only the Countess of Salisbury. After Princess Margaret died, the descendants of Richard Pole and Princess Margaret could also inherit the earldom. But the problem is, Salisbury is just a small town in Wiltshire, which is far behind the earldom of a county, let alone compared with Yorkshire, the largest county in England. Yorkshire was later divided into 5 counties: West Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Wanderside and Cleveland. Together, they cover an area of about 15,000 square kilometers, much larger than the electorate of Saxony. Ordinary duchies are not so large. Compared with a small town and a super county of 15,000 square kilometers, even a fool would know which one to choose. What's more, the Lord of Yorkshire is a duke, which is far from being comparable to the Earl of a small town in Salisbury. Of course, Richard Pole is a die-hard fan of Henry VII, and if the letter is really sent to him, he may not be willing to accept it. Therefore, Marin did not intend to send the letter to him, but planned to send it to Henry VII through the hands of others. Therefore, Marin's specific plan was to send someone to send the letter to the military camp where Richard Pole was, but before sending the letter, he deliberately asked Princess Margaret to find a reason to call him home. After all, Henry VII had not officially started the northern expedition yet, and was still in the stage of counting spoils and arguing with the French. As for Edward, according to intelligence personnel from the North Sea Chamber of Commerce in London, Henry VII was no longer in a hurry to encircle and suppress Edward after sending ships to control the Irish Sea. Anyway, having cut off Edward's retreat, Henry VII felt quite confident. In other words, although the 20,000 British troops in London were not disbanded, they were in the stage of counting spoils of war, had not yet completed the reward to the navy, and had not yet settled the French prisoners, and had not yet officially marched north. At this time, Princess Margaret could find a reason to trick Richard Pole back home from the barracks. When Richard Pole returned home, Edward would send someone to the barracks to deliver a letter to Richard Pole. Moreover, the secret letter was deliberately not sealed so that the officer who received the letter on his behalf could see it. In order to increase the curiosity of the officer who received the letter, the person who delivered the letter could act sneaky to arouse the curiosity of the officer who received the letter. When the officer saw the content of the letter, he would be horrified. After all, in the letter, Edward asked Richard Pole to control the entire army to rebel and kill Henry VII. This matter was too big, and the officer who saw the letter would definitely not dare to act on his own and would hand the letter over. Then, he would wait for Henry VII's reaction. A fox like Henry VII who is good at calculating people is very suspicious. If he saw this letter, even if he still believed in Richard Pole, he would probably not dare to continue to hand over all the troops to Richard Pole. After all, Edward was willing to spend money, he even promised the title and fiefdom of the Duke of York, which was only available to princes. Most people would definitely be tempted. Henry VII certainly didn't dare to gamble on the loyalty of his men, so he would have to change his coach. A few days later, a sneaky guy came to the camp gate outside the city of London. After confirming that Richard Pole had been tricked back home, he found the guard at the gate and asked to see Richard Pole. The guard ignored him, and the sneaky guy threw a handful of gold coins. The British guard at the gate suddenly lost his balance, so he called an officer to deal with it. The officer was just a middle-level officer passing by, and he was curious and rushed to deal with the matter. When the officer asked about the relationship between the sneaky messenger and Richard Pole, the messenger just stammered that he was a subordinate of Richard Pole's relative and had something urgent to do with Sir Richard Pole. The messenger grabbed a handful of gold coins and stuffed them into the officer's pocket, asking him to pass on this family letter. Then, the messenger left in a panic. The officer was just a middle-lower-level officer with a low income, and was stunned by the handful of gold coins at once, not much different from the previous guards. But after a while, the officer finally reacted. If it was really a letter from a relative, why was he so sneaky and panicky? This is suspicious. Seeing that the letter was not sealed, the officer couldn't help but took out the letter and read it. After reading the letter, the officer was so scared that he almost couldn't stand up. Damn. This is a shocking case, I can't cover it up. So the officer immediately handed in the letter. Then, his boss was almost scared to death. Then, the letter was sent directly to the Tower of London in London. What? Edward wants to bribe Richard. When Henry VII first heard the report, he didn't care. Because he trusted his confidants. However, when Henry VII saw the letter with his own eyes, his face changed. It was because Edward's conditions were too generous, and people couldn't help but be tempted. Hereditary Duke of Yorkshire. In the Kingdom of England, the area of this territory is second only to Wales, the Prince of Wales. But the Prince of Wales is the future king, which is incomparable. Therefore, the Duke of York can be said to be the largest prince in the UK. Although Richard Pole served Henry VII for many years, Henry VII only gave him a low-level title of knight in the end. Although he was given a wife of an earl, this benefit can only be enjoyed by the next generation. As for Richard Pole himself, he was not blessed to enjoy it. Moreover, Salisbury is just a small town, and Yorkshire is the largest county in England. There is no comparison at all. Edward is so generous that it makes Henry VII look extremely stingy. You know, Richard Pole is a loyal and capable man of Henry VII. Henry VII was a little unsure for a while, so he invited the shrewd Earl of Derby, Thomas Stanley, to the palace to discuss the matter. After reading the letter, Thomas Stanley hesitated for a long time and finally said, "Your Majesty, in fact, I don't quite believe that Richard Pole will betray you. But, we have to be on guard." "What do you mean?" "I believe in Richard Pole's character, but the conditions offered by Edward are too generous, so generous that it makes people jealous. Therefore, we must also prevent Richard Pole from being tempted. Although, the probability is relatively small. But no matter how small the probability is, we must prevent it from happening." After a pause, Thomas Stanley continued. "Your Majesty, you have given Richard Pole too much power. Handing over the entire nation's army to him is like handing over our lives to him. If he really falls in love with us, we will all die without a burial place. After all, Richard Pole is indeed Edward's legitimate brother-in-law." Henry VII nodded. He was also worried about this. If Richard Pole had no relationship with Edward, he could have taken this letter as a joke. However, as Thomas Stanley said, Richard Pole's wife was indeed Edward's biological sister. Richard Pole himself was also Edward's undisputed biological brother-in-law. Edward's promise to others might not necessarily be fulfilled, but to his own biological brother-in-law, it would definitely be fulfilled. Moreover, Henry VII did not dare to guarantee whether Richard Pole had been influenced by his wife, Princess Margaret, over the years. If he was greatly influenced, this letter would likely move Richard Pole. Then, change a commander? Well, change one. Anyway, Edward's strength is not as strong as ours. As long as the commander does not lean towards the other side, there should be no problem. Thomas Stanley nodded. Then, the next day, after Richard Pole finished dealing with his family affairs and had not returned to the barracks, he was told that he was transferred from his post. "Your Majesty, why?" Richard Pole was a little confused, so he went to find Henry VII. Henry VII was a little embarrassed. In order not to disappoint his trusted general, he looked to Thomas Stanley for help. Thomas Stanley had no choice but to say, "Richard, this is the result of our discussion. They think that it is too cruel to let you lead troops to kill your brother-in-law. So, let someone else do it. Please rest assured, Your Majesty and Lord Stanley, I will not be partial to Edward and let him go." Richard Pole patted his chest and promised. But Henry VII and Thomas Stanley looked at each other, and the same thought came to their minds at the same time. "It's a pity that I dare not believe you." Chapter 670, Change of Commander. It is no wonder that Henry VII and Thomas Stanley were afraid, because 20,000 troops were almost the entire assets of the Kingdom of England. Controlling this army was equivalent to controlling the life and death of the Kingdom of England. If Richard Pole had any idea of rebellion, Henry VII and Thomas Stanley and others would die without a burial place, and their entire family would die without a burial place. When Qin Shi Huang handed over a total of 600,000 troops in the country to Wang Jian to destroy the state of Chu, he was extremely worried, his face was gloomy, and his heart was afraid, because he handed over all his assets to Wang Jian. Wang Jian was a smart man and knew that Yingzheng was worried, so he shamelessly asked Yingzheng to give him more fertile land and manors, with an attitude of, "I just want money," which finally dispelled the doubts of the first emperor. And Bai Qi, another Qin war god before Wang Jian, was suspected because he did not pay attention to the feelings of the king of Qin, and eventually died. So, for a monarch, when he hands over all his troops to you, your glory and danger coexist. Because the monarch will always worry that you will overthrow him with the army in your hands. It is for this reason that Marin personally led the troops to fight in every war. In addition to the fact that his own talents are indeed better than his subordinates, he is also worried that the army will be in the hands of his generals, which will bring danger to himself. Therefore, after the incident of Edward's letter, whether Henry VII believed in Richard Bull or not, there would be a huge shadow in his heart. Unless he is willing to entrust all his life to Richard Bull, otherwise, the general monarch will choose to change the commander. This has nothing to do with right or wrong, but human nature, and there is no solution. In the end, Richard Bull, Henry VII's confidant, was dismissed from his position as the commander of 20,000 British troops, and then was arranged by Henry VII to be responsible for negotiations with the French. This time, the French not only sent a large amount of food and supplies to England, as well as artillery and other supplies, but also 7,000 prisoners of war, and more than 10,000 civilians were captured. So, there is something to talk about between the two sides. Richard Bull was appointed by Henry VII as the temporary foreign minister, with full responsibility for negotiations with France. Of course, in order to appease Richard Bull, Henry VII rewarded him with a lot of money. As for the new commander of the 20,000 British troops, Henry VII discussed with his ministers for a long time and finally decided to let Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, Henry the Younger, replace Richard Bull as the new commander of the British Army. Originally, Henry VII also considered John de Wheeler, Earl of Oxford, and Thomas Howard, son of Howard, Duke of Norfolk. However, John de Wheeler, Earl of Oxford, was fickle, and although Henry VII was grateful for his support for him to become king, he betrayed Richard III, and God knows whether he would be bribed by Edward. Thomas Howard, the son of the Duke of Norfolk, liked naval battles and was not very proficient in land battles. Therefore, Henry VII could only choose Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, the 5th Earl of Northumberland, who was only 27 years old, as the commander-in-chief. Henry Percy also had a strong desire to fight, because his fiefdom was in Northumberland, the northernmost county in England. However, since the Scottish army looted several northern counties the year before, he had not received taxes from his fiefdom for 2 years, which seriously affected his luxurious life in London. Only by defeating Edward and regaining several northern counties could he regain the rent and taxes from the large fiefdom in Northumberland and maintain his decent aristocratic life. Of course, his ability was not bad. Although not as good as Richard Bull, his personality was stable. He was not very outstanding, but he did not have too many shortcomings. For such a person, it should not be a big problem to command 20,000 British troops to deal with Edward's 10,000 troops. Moreover, Henry VII believed that after the French were defeated, the morale of the French soldiers under Edward's command must have been severely hit. Because the French plan to invade England failed, and Edward mainly relied on the French soldiers. In this way, there was no reason for the 20,000 English soldiers with high morale to lose. Henry Percy, the 5th Earl of Northumberland, was also very excited. After all, he was only 27 years old and it was his first time to lead troops. Moreover, he commanded almost all the regular troops of the Kingdom of England, except the London Guards. For the young Earl Henry, this was definitely a brilliant experience. Many years later, he also had the capital to brag to future generations. Think about it, your grandfather led the whole country's troops and pacified tens of thousands of rebels. Because the French used ships to deliver the food and grass needed for the 20,000 troops, Henry VII is not short of food now. The food and grass that were burned outside Birmingham before are all retrieved from the unfortunate French. Moreover, there are still a lot of surplus. Seeing that there was no sign of mutiny in the French army under Edward, Henry VII was too lazy to wait any longer. So, after Henry VII imprisoned all the French prisoners and sent many sailors to guard them, all the army officers and soldiers, led by the new commander Henry Percy, marched to Yorkshire in the north. The Confident Henry Percy did not follow Richard Pole's original plan to go north from the west, but directly planned to go north from several counties in the central and eastern parts that were plagued by the Robin Hood bandits. Although the ultimate goal was to eliminate Edward, Henry Percy did not mind destroying the so-called Robin Hood bandits on the way, so that the counties in the central and eastern parts of England that were originally in chaos could be restored to order. After all, if the Robin Hood bandits were pacified, it would be a credit. In fact, Henry Percy had his own considerations when he led his army through several counties in the central and eastern parts. Because, as far as he knew, there were more than 100,000 refugees fleeing from the north in the 4 central counties. Among them, the refugees from his Northumberland county were estimated to be 20,000 to 30,000. This time, Henry Percy passed through 4 counties in the central region. In addition to wanting to destroy the Robin Hood bandits, he also wanted to plunder a large number of refugees from the 4 counties in the central region, Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, and Derbyshire. After all, these refugees are also labor. As long as they can take hundreds of thousands of refugees with them on the way north, they can successfully supplement the population loss problem in Northumberland. There is even money to be made. After all, there are many refugees from other counties among these hundreds of thousands of refugees. Moreover, there are very few old and weak refugees who can survive until now, because most of the old and weak died in the famine. Bringing back so many strong refugees is absolutely the best thing for Northumberland, which is vast and sparsely populated. The reason why Henry Percy snatched the position of Commander-in-Chief of the British Army was to use the soldiers to help him coerce and escort a large number of refugees to his own territory, Northumberland. As long as he brings hundreds of thousands of people back to Northumberland, he will not only make up for the previous population loss, but also earn a lot of people back. As long as he has people to help him farm and exploit him, he won't have to worry about having no money to spend in the future. Northumberland County has no shortage of land, but it lacks labor. The British Army, led by Henry Percy, quickly entered Leicestershire. But after that, the British Army began to look for bandit gangs everywhere to beat, and at the same time began to force a large number of refugees to follow the army north. According to Henry Percy's idea, he led hundreds of thousands of refugees to the north with the army, and after defeating Edward, who was entrenched in York City, he directly sent the hundreds of thousands of refugees that the army had taken with him to the border of Northumberland County and the northern border of York County. After a little arrangement, he can take Edward himself or his body back to London to receive the reward. Fighting and seeking personal gain at the same time, it's perfect.